Chapter 13 of Viking Tales. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Part 2, Chapter 13. Eric the Red. It was a spring day, many years after Ingolf died. All the freemen in the west of Iceland had come to a meeting. Here they made laws and punished men for having done wrong. The meeting was over now. Men were walking about the plain and talking. Everybody seemed much excited. Voices were loud, arms were swinging. "It was an unjust decision," someone cried. "Eric killed the men in fair fight. The judges outlawed him because they were afraid. His foe Thorgest has many rich and powerful men to back him." "No, no," said another. "Eric is a bloody man. I am glad he is out of Iceland." Just then, a big man with bushy red hair and beard stalked through the crowd. He looked straight ahead and scowled. "There he goes," people said, and turned to look after him. "His hands are as red as his beard," some said, and frowned. But others looked at him and smiled, saying, "He walks like Thor the Fearless." "His story would make a fine song," one said. "As strong and as brave and as red as Thor, always in a quarrel. A man of many places. Norway, the north of Iceland, the west of Iceland, those little islands off the shore of Iceland. Outlawed from all of them on account of his quarrels. Where will he go now, I wonder?" This Eric strode down to the shore with his men following. "He is in a black temper," they said. "We should best not talk to him." So they made ready the boat in silence. Eric got into the pilot's seat and they sailed off. Soon they pulled the ship up on their own shore. Eric strolled into his house and called for supper. When the drinking horns had been filled and emptied, Eric pulled himself up and smiled and shouted out so that the great room was full of his big voice. "There is no friend like mead. It always cheers a man's heart." Then laughter and talking began in the hall, because Eric's good temper had come back. After a while, Eric said, "Well, I must off somewhere. I have been driven about from place to place like a seabird in a storm, and there is always a storm about me. It is my sword's fault. She is ever itching to break her peace bands and be out and at the play. She has shut Norway to me, and now Iceland. Where will you go next, old comrade?" And he pulled out his sword and looked at it and smiled as the fire flashed on it. "There are some of us who will follow you wherever you go, Eric," called a man from across the fire. "Is it so?" Eric cried, leaping up. "Oh, then we shall have some merry times yet. Who will go with me?" More than half the men in the hall jumped to their feet and waved their drinking horns and shouted, "I! I!" Eric sat down in his chair and laughed. "Oh, you bloody birds of battle," he cried, "ever hungry for new frolic. Our swords are sisters in blood, and we are brothers in adventure. Do you know what is in my heart to do?" He jumped to his feet and his face glowed. Then he laughed as he looked at his men. "I see the answer flashing from your eyes," he said. "That you will do it even if it is to go down to Niflheim and drag up Hela, the pale queen of the stiff dead." His men pounded on the tables and shouted, "Yes, yes, anywhere behind Eric." "But it is not to Niflheim," Eric laughed. "Did you ever hear that story that Gunnbjorn told? He was sailing for Iceland, but the fog came down, and the wind caught him and blew him far off. While he drifted about, he saw a strange land that rose up white and shining out of a blue sea. Huge ships of ice sailed out from it and met him. I mean to sail to that land." A great shout went up that shook the rafters. Then the men sat and talked over plans. While they sat, a stranger came into the hall. "I have no time to drink," he said. "I have a message from your friend Eyjolf. He says that Thorgest and all his men means to come here and catch you tonight. Eyjolf bids you to come to him, and he will hide you until you are ready to start, for he loves you. Hunted like a wolf from corner to corner of the world, Eric cried angrily. "Will they not even let me finish one feast?" Then he laughed. "But if I take my sport like a wolf, I must be hunted like one. So we shall sleep tonight in the woods about Eyolf's house, comrades, instead of in these good beds." "Well, we have done it before." "And it is no bad place," cried some of the men. "I always like the stars better than a smoky house fire," said one. "Can no bad fortune spoil your good nature?" laughed Eric. "But now we are off. Let every man carry what he can." So they quickly loaded themselves with clothes and gold and swords and spears and kettles of food. Eric led his wife Thorhild and his 2 young sons, Thorstein and Leif. Altogether they got into the boat and went to Eyolf's farm. For a week or more they stayed in his woods, sometimes in a secret cave of his when they knew that Thorgest was about. And sometimes Eyolf sent and said, "Thorgest is off. Come to my house for a feast." All this time they were making ready for the voyage, repairing the ship and filling it with stores. Word of what Eric meant to do got out, and men laughed and said, "Is that not like Eric? What will he not do?" Some men liked the sound of it, and they came to Eric and said, "We will go with you to this strange land." So all were ready, and they pushed off with Eric's family aboard and those friends who had joined him. They took horses and cattle with them, and all kinds of tools and food. "I do not well know where this land is," Eric said. "Gunnbjorn said only that he sailed east when he came home to Iceland. So I will steer straight west. We shall surely find something. I do not know either how long we must go." So they sailed that strange ocean, never dreaming what might be ahead of them. They found no islands to rest on. They met heavy fogs. One day, as Eric sat in the pilot's seat, he said, "I think that I see one of Gunnbjorn's ships of ice. Shall we sail up to her and see what kind of a craft she is?" "Yes," shouted his men. So they went on toward it. "It sends out a cold breath," said one of the men. They all wrapped their cloaks about them. "It is a bigger boat than I ever saw before," said Eric. "The white mast stands as high as a hill. It must be giants that sail in it, frost giants," said another of the men. But as they came nearer, Eric all at once laughed loudly and called out, "By Thor, that Gunnbjorn was a foolish fellow. Why, look, it is only a piece of floating ice, such as we sometimes see from Iceland. It is no ship, and there is no one on it." His men laughed, and one called to another and said, "And you thought of frost giants." Then they sailed on for days and days. They met many of these icebergs. On one of them was a white bear. "Yonder is a strange pilot," Eric laughed. "I have seen bears come floating so to the north shore of Iceland," an old man said. "Perhaps they come from the land that we are going to find." One day Eric said, "I see afar off an iceberg larger than any one yet. Perhaps that is our white land." But even as he said it, he felt his boat swing under his hand as he held the tiller. He bore hard on the rudder, but he could not turn the ship. "What is this?" he cried. "A strong river is running here. It is carrying our ship away from this land. I cannot make head against it. Out with the oars." So with oars and sail and rudder they fought against the current. But it took the boat along like a chip, and after a while they put up their oars and drifted. "Luck has taken us into its own hands," Eric laughed. "But this is as good a way as another." Sometimes they were near enough to see the land, and then they were carried out into the sea and thought they should never see any land again. "Perhaps this river will carry us to a whirlpool and suck us under," the men said. But at last Eric felt the current less strong under his hand. "To the oars again," he called. So they fought with the current and sailed out of it and went toward land. But when they reached the shore, they found no place to go in. Steep black walls shot up from the sea. Nothing grew on them. When the men looked above the cliffs, they saw a long line of white cutting the sky. "It is a land of ice," they said. They sailed on south all the time, looking for a place to go ashore. "I am sick of this endless sea," Thorhild complained. "But this land is worse." After a while, they began to see small bays cut into the shore with little flat patches of green at their sides. They landed in these places and stretched and warmed themselves and ate. "But these spots are only big enough for graves," the men said. "We cannot live here." So they went on again. All the time the weather was growing colder. Eric's people kept themselves wrapped in their cloaks and put scarves around their heads. "And it is still summer," Thorhild said. "What will it be in winter?" "We must find a place to build a house now, before the winter comes on," said Eric. "We must not freeze here." So they chose a little spot with hills about it to keep off the wind. They made a house out of stones, for there were many in that place. They lived there that winter. The sea, for a long way out from shore, froze so that it looked like white land. The men went out upon it to hunt white bear and seal. They ate the meat and wore the skins to keep them warm. The hardest thing was to get fuel for the fire. No trees grew there. The men found a little driftwood along the shore, but it was not enough. So they burned the bones and the fat of the animals they killed. "It is a sickening smell," Thorhild said. "I have not been out of this mean house for weeks. I am tired of the darkness and the smoke and the cattle. And all the time I hear great noises as though some giant were breaking this land into pieces." "Ah, cheer up, good wife," Eric laughed. "I smell better luck ahead." Once, Eric and his men climbed to the cliffs and went back into the middle of the land. When they came home, they had this to tell. "It is a country of ice, shining white. Nothing grows on it but a few mosses. Far off it looks flat, but when you walk upon it, there are great holes and cracks. We could see nothing beyond. There seems to be only a fringe of land around the edge of an island of ice." The winter nights were very long. Sometimes the sun showed for an hour, sometimes for only a few minutes. Sometimes it did not show at all for a week. The men hunted by the bright shining of the moon or by the northern lights. As it grew warmer, the ice in the sea began to crack and move and melt and float away. Eric waited only until there was a clear passage in the water. Then he launched his boat and they sailed southward again. At last they found a place that Eric liked. "Here I will build my house," he said. So they did, and lived there that summer, and pastured their cattle, and cut hay for the winter, and fished and hunted. The next spring Eric said, "The land stretches far north. I am hungry to know what is there." Then they all got into the boat again and sailed north. "We can leave no one here," Eric had said. "We cannot tell what might come between us. Perhaps giants or dragons or strange men might come out of this inland ice and kill our people. We must stay together." Farther north, they found only the same bare, frozen country. So after a while, they sailed back to their home and lived there. One spring, after they had been in that land for 4 years, Eric said, "My eyes are hungry for the sight of men and green fields again. My stomach is sick of seal and whale and bear. My throat is dry for mead. This is a bare and cold and hungry land. I will visit my friends in Iceland." "And our swords are rusty with long resting," said his men. "Perhaps we can find play for them in Iceland." "Now I have a plan," Eric suddenly said. "Would it not be pleasant to see other feast halls as we sail along the coast?" "Oh, it would be a beautiful sight," his men said. "Well," said Eric, "I am going to try to bring back some neighbors from Iceland. Now we must have a name for our land. How does Greenland sound?" His men laughed and said, "It is a very white Greenland, but men will like the sound of it. It is better than Iceland." So Eric and all his people sailed back and spent the winter with his friends. "Ah, Eric, it is good to hear your laugh again," they said. Eric was at many feasts and saw many men, and he talked much of his Greenland. "The sea is full of whale and seals and great fish," he said. "The land has bear and reindeer. There are no men there. Come back with me and choose your land." Many men said they would do it. Some men went because they thought it would be a great frolic to go to a new country. Some went because they were poor in Iceland and thought, I can be no worse off in Greenland, and perhaps I shall grow rich there." And some went because they loved Eric and wanted to be his neighbors. So the next summer, 35 ships full of men and women and goods followed Eric for Greenland. But they met heavy storms, and some ships were wrecked, and the men drowned. Other men grew heartsick at the terrible storm and the long voyage and no sight of land, and they turned back to Iceland. So of those 35 ships, only 15 got to Greenland. "Only the bravest and the luckiest men come here," Eric said. "We shall have good neighbors." Soon, other houses were built along the fjords. "It is pleasant to sail along the coast now," said Eric. "I see smoke rising from houses, and ships standing on the shore, and friendly hands waving." End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Viking Tales. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Part 2, Chapter 14. Leif and His New Land. Now Eric had lived in Greenland for 15 years. His sons Thorstein and Leif had grown up to be big, strong men. One spring, Leif said to his father, "I have never seen Norway, our motherland. I long to go there and meet the great men and see the places that skalds sing about." Eric answered, "It is right that you should go. No man has really lived until he has seen Norway." So he helped Leif fit out a boat and sent him off. Leif sailed for months. He passed Iceland and the Faroes and the Shetlands. He stopped at all of these places and feasted his mind on the new things. And everywhere men received him gladly, for he was handsome and wise. But at last he came near Norway. Then he stood up before the pilot's seat and sang loudly, "My eyes can see her at last, the mother of mighty men, the field of famous fights. In the sky above I see fair Asgard's shining roofs, the flying hair of Thor, the wings of Odin's birds, the road that heroes tread. I am here in the land of the gods, the land of mighty men." For a while he walked the land as though he were in a dream. He looked at this and that and everything, and he loved them all because it was Norway. "I will go to the king," he said. He had never seen a king. There were no kings in Iceland or in Greenland. So he went to the city where the king had his fine house. The king's name was Olaf. He was a great-grandson of Harald Hairfair, for Harald had been dead 100 years. Now the king was going to hold a feast at night, and Leif put on his most beautiful clothes to go to it. He put on long tights of blue wool and a short jacket of blue velvet. He belted his jacket with a gold girdle. He had shoes of scarlet with golden clasps. He threw around himself a cape of scarlet velvet lined with seal fur. His long sword stuck out from under his cloak. On his head he put a knitted cap of bright colors. Then he walked to the king's feast hall and went through the door. It was a great hall, and it was full of richly dressed men. The fires shone on so many golden headbands and bracelets, and so many glittering swords and spears on the wall. And there was so much noise of talking and laughing that at first Leif did not know what to do. But at last he went and sat on the very end seat of the bench near him. As the feast went on, King Olaf sat in his high seat and looked about the hall and noticed this one and that one and spoke across the fire to many. He was keen-eyed and soon saw Leif in his far seat. "Yonder is some man of mark," he said to himself. "He is surely worth knowing. His face is not the face of a fool. He carries his head like a lord of men." He sent a thrall and asked Leif to come to him. So Leif walked down the long hall and stood before the king. "I am glad to have you for a guest," the king said. "What are your name and country?" "I am Leif Erikson, and I have come all the way from Greenland to see you and old Norway." "From Greenland?" said the king. "It is not often that I see a Greenlander. Many come to Norway to trade, but they seldom come to the king's hall. I shall be glad to hear about your land. Come up and speak with me." So Leif went up the steps of the high seat and sat down by the king and talked with him. When the feast was over, the king said, "You shall live at my court this winter, Leif Erikson. You are a welcome guest." So Leif stayed there that winter. When he started back in the spring, the king gave him 2 thralls as a parting gift. "Let this gift show my love, Leif Erikson," he said. "For your sake, I shall not forget Greenland." Leif sailed back again and had good luck until he was past Iceland. Then great winds came out of the north and tossed his ship about so that the men could do nothing. They were blown south for days and days. They did not know where they were. Then they saw land, and Leif said, "Surely luck has brought us also to a new country. We shall go in and see what kind of a place it is." So he steered for it. As they came near, the men said, "See the great trees and the soft green shore? Surely this is a better country than Greenland, or than Iceland either." When they landed, they threw themselves upon the ground. "I never lay on a bed so soft as this grass," one said. "Taller trees do not grow in Norway," said another. "There is no stone here, as in Norway, but only good black dirt," Leif said. "I never saw so fertile a land before." The men were hungry and set about building a fire. "There is no lack of fuel here," they said. They stayed many days in this country and walked about to see what was there. A German named Turker was with Leif. He was a little man with a high forehead and a short nose. His eyes were big and rolling. He had lived with Eric for many years and had taken care of Leif when he was a little boy, so Leif loved him. Now, one day, they had been wandering about, and all came back to camp at night except Turker. When Leif looked around on his comrades, he said, "Where is Turker?" No one knew. Then Leif was angry. "Is a man of so little value in this empty land that you would lose one?" he said. "Why did you not keep together? Did you not see that he was gone? Why did you not set out to look for him? Who knows what terrible thing may have happened to him in these great forests?" Then he turned and started out to hunt for him. His men followed, silent and ashamed. They had not gone far when they saw Turker running toward them. He was laughing and talking to himself. Leif ran to him and put his arms about him with gladness at seeing him. "Why are you so late?" he asked. "Where have you been?" But Turker, still smiling and nodding his head, answered in German. He pointed to the woods and laughed and rolled his eyes. Again, Leif asked his question and put his hand on Turker's shoulder as though he would shake him. Then Turker answered in the language of Iceland. "I have not been so very far, but I have found something wonderful." "What is it?" cried the men. "I have found grapes growing wild," answered Turker. And he laughed and his eyes shone. "It cannot be," Leif said. "Grapes do not grow in Greenland, nor in Iceland, nor even in Norway, so it seemed a wonderful thing to these Norsemen." "Can I not tell grapes when I see them?" cried Turker. "Did I not grow up in Germany, where every hillside is covered with grapevines? Ah, it seems like my old home." "It is wonderful," Leif said. "I have heard travelers tell of seeing grapes growing, but I myself never saw it. You shall take us to them early in the morning, Turker." So in the morning they went back into the woods and saw the grapes. They ate of them. "They are like food and drink," they cried. That day, Leif said, "We spent most of the summer on the ocean. Winter will soon be coming on, and the sea about Greenland will be frozen. We must start back. I mean to take some of the things of this land to show our people at home. We will fill the rowboat with grapes and tow it behind us. The ship we will load with logs from these great trees. That will be a welcome shipload in Greenland, where we have neither trees nor vines. Now half of you shall gather grapes for the next few days, and the other half shall cut timber." So they did, and after a week sailed off. The ship was full of lumber, and they towed the rowboat loaded with grapes. As they looked back at the shore, Leif said, "I will call this country Wineland, for the grapes that grow there. One of the men leaped up on the gunwale and leaned out, clinging to the sail and sang, "Wineland the good, Wineland the warm, Wineland the green, the great, the fat, our dragon fed and crawls away, with belly stuffed and lazy feet, how long her purple trailing tail, she fed and grew to twice her size." Then all the men waved their hands to the shore and gave a great shout for that good land. For all that voyage they had fair weather and sailed into Eric's harbor before the winter came. Eric saw the ship and ran down to the shore. He took Leif into his arms and said, "Oh, my son, my old eyes ached to see you. I hunger to hear of all that you have seen and done." "Luck has followed me all the way," said Leif. "See what I have brought home." The Greenlanders looked. "Lumber! Lumber!" they cried. "Oh, it is better stuff than gold." Then they saw the grapes and tasted them. "Surely you must have plundered Asgard," they said, smacking their lips. At the feast that night, Eric said, "Leif shall sit in the place of honor." So Leif sat in the high seat opposite Eric. All men thought him a handsome and wise man. He told them of the storm and of Wineland. No man would ever need a cloak there. The soil is richer than the soil of Norway. Grain grows wild, and you yourselves saw the grapes that we got from there. The forests are without end. The sea is full of fish. The Greenlanders listened with open mouths to all this. They turned and talked to Leif's ship comrades who were scattered among them. Leif noticed two strangers, an old man who sat at Eric's side and a young woman on the crossbench. He turned to his brother Thorstein, who sat next to him. "Who are these strangers?" he asked. "Thorbjorn and his daughter Gudrid," Thorstein answered. "They landed here this spring. I never saw our father more glad of anything than to see this Thorbjorn. They were friends before we left Iceland. When they saw each other again, they could not talk enough of old times. In the spring, Eric means to give him a farm up the fjord away. It seems that this Thorbjorn comes of a good family that has been rich and great in Iceland for years. And Thorbjorn himself was rich when our father knew him, and was much honored by all men. But ill luck came, and he grew poor. This hurt his pride. "I will not stay in Iceland and be a beggar," he said to himself. "I will not have men look at me and say, 'He is not what his father was.' I will go to my friend Eric the Red in Greenland." Then he got ready a great feast and invited all his friends. It was such a feast as had not been in Iceland for years. Thorbjorn spent on it all the wealth that he had left. For he said to himself, "I will not leave in shame. Men shall remember my last feast." After that he set out and came to Greenland. "Is not Gudrid beautiful? And she is wise. I mean to marry her if her father will permit it." Now Leif settled down in Greenland and became a great man there. He was so busy and he grew so rich that he did not think of going to Wineland again. But people could not forget his story. Many nights, as men sat about the long fires, they talked of that wonderful land and wished to see it. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Viking Tales. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Part 2, West Overseas. Chapter 15. Wineland the Good. On an autumn, a year or two after Leif came home, Eric and his men saw two large ships come to land, not far down the shore from the house. "They look like trading ships," Eric said. "Let us go down to see them." "I will go too," Gudrid said. "Perhaps they will have rich cloth and jewelry. It is long since I had my eyes on a new dress." So they all went down and found two large trading ships lying in the water. A great many men were on the shore making a fire. "Welcome to Greenland," called Eric. "What are your names and your country?" Then a fine big man walked out from among the men and went up to Eric. "I am Thorfinn," he said, "a trader. I sailed this summer from Iceland with 40 men and a shipload of goods. On the sea I met this other ship from Iceland. The master is Bjarni. Come and look at my goods." So he rowed Eric and Gudrid out, and they went aboard his boat. Thorfinn opened his chests and showed Eric gleaming swords and bracelets and axes and farm tools. But before Gudrid he spread beautiful cloth and gold embroidery and golden necklaces. As they looked, he told of doings in Iceland and asked of Greenland. "We never see such things as these in this bare land," Gudrid said, as she smoothed a beautiful dress of purple velvet. "I envy the women of Iceland their fair clothes." "There is no need of that," Thorfinn said, "for this dress is yours, and anything else from my chests that you like. Here is a necklace that I beg you to take. It did not have a fairer mistress in Greece where I got it." "You are a very generous trader," Gudrid said. Then Thorfinn gave Eric a great sword with a gold-studded scabbard. After a while he took them to Bjarni's ship. He also gave them gifts. They all talked and laughed much while they were together. "You are merry comrades," Eric said. "I ask you both and all your men to spend the winter at my house. You can put your goods in my storehouses." "By my sword, a generous offer," said Thorfinn. "As for me, I am happy to come." Bjarni and all the rest said the same thing. Thorfinn walked to the house with Eric and Gudrid, while the other men sailed to the ship sheds and put their boats under them. Then Thorfinn saw to the unloading and storing of his goods. "Is this Gudrid your daughter?" he asked of Eric one day. "She is the widow of my son Thorstein," Eric said. "He died the same winter that they were married. Her father, too, died not long ago, so Gudrid lives with me." Now all that winter until Yuletime, Eric spread a good feast every night. There was laughter through his house all the time. Often at the feasts the men cast lots to see whether they might sit on the crossbench with the women. Sometimes it was Thorfinn's luck to sit by Gudrid. Then they talked gaily and drank together. At last Yule was coming near. Eric went about the house gloomy then. One day Thorfinn put his hand on Eric's shoulder and said, "Something is troubling you, Eric. We have all noticed that you are not as gay as you used to be. Tell me, what is the matter?" "You have carried yourselves like noble men in my house," Eric answered. "I am proud to have you for guests. Now I am ashamed that you should not find a house worthy of you. I am ashamed that when you leave me, you will have to say that you never spent a worse Yule than you did with Eric the Red in Greenland, for my cupboards are empty." "Oh, that is easily mended," Thorfinn said. "No house could feed 80 men so long and not feel it. I never knew so generous a host before. But I have flour and grain and mead in my boat. You are welcome to all of it. You have only to open the doors of your own storehouses. It is a little gift." So Eric used those things, and there was never a merrier Yule feast than in his house that winter. When Yule was over, Thorfinn said to Eric, "Gudrid is a beautiful and wise woman. I wish to have her for my wife." "You seem to be a man worthy of her," Eric said. So that winter Gudrid and Thorfinn were married and lived at Eric's house. One day Thorfinn said to Eric, "I have heard much of this wonderful Wineland since I have been here. It seems to me that it is worthwhile to go and see more of it." "My son Thorstein and I tried it once," said Eric. "It was the year after Leif came back. We set out with a fair ship and with glad hearts, but we tossed about all summer on the sea and got nowhere. We were wet with storm, lean with hunger and illness, and heartsick at our bad luck." "And yet," Thorfinn said, "another time we might have better weather. I have never seen so fair a land as this seems to be." Then he went to Leif and talked long with him. Leif told him in what direction he had sailed to come home, and how the shores looked that he had passed. "I think I could find my way," Thorfinn said. "My heart moves me to try this frolic." He spoke to Gudrid about it. "Oh, yes," she cried, "let us go. It is long since I felt a boat leaping under me. I am tired of sitting still. I want to feel the warm days and see the soft grass and the high trees and taste the grapes of this wineland the good." Then he talked with his men and with Bjarni. "We are ready," they all said. "We are only waiting for a leader." "Then let us go," cried Thorfinn. So, in the spring, they fitted up their 2 ships and put into them provisions and a few cattle. Some of Eric's men also got ready a boat, so that 3 ships set sail from Eric's harbor carrying 160 men to Wineland. As they started, Gudrid stood on the deck and sang, "I will feast my eyes on new things, on mighty trees and purple grapes, on beds of flowers and soft grass. I will sun myself in a warm land." They sailed on and passed those shores that Leif had spoken of. Whenever they saw any interesting place, they sailed in and looked about and rested there. They had gone far south past many fair shores with woods on them, when Gudrid said one day, "This is a beautiful bay with a smooth green field by it, and the great mountains far back. I should like to stay there for a little while." So they sailed in and drew their ships up on shore. They put up the awnings in them. "These shall be our houses," Thorfinn said. They were strange-looking houses, shining dragons with gay backs lying on the yellow sand. Near them, the Norsemen lighted fires and cooked their supper. That night they slept in the ships. In the morning, Gudrid said, "I long to see what is back of that mountain." So they all climbed it. When they stood on the top, they could see far over the country. "There is a lake that we must see," Thorfinn said. "I should like to sail around that bay," said Bjarni, pointing. "I am going to walk up that valley yonder," one of the men said. And everyone saw some place where he would like to go. So for all that summer they camped in that spot and went about the country seeing new things. They hunted in the woods and caught rabbits and birds, and sometimes bears and deer. Every day some men rowed out to sea and fished. There was an island in the bay where thousands of birds had their nests. The men gathered eggs there. "We have more to eat than we had in Greenland or Iceland," Thorfinn said, "and need not work at all. It is all play." Near the end of summer, Thorfinn spoke to his comrades. "Have we not seen everything here? Let us go to a new place. We have not yet found grapes." Thorfinn and Bjarni and all their men sailed south again, but some of Eric's men went off in their boat another way. Years afterward, the Greenlanders heard that they were shipwrecked and made slaves in Ireland. After Thorfinn and Bjarni had sailed for many days, they landed on a low green place. There were hills around it. A little lake was there. "What is growing on those hillsides?" Thorfinn said, shading his eyes with his hand. He and some others ran up there. The people on shore heard them shout. Soon they came running back with their hands full of something. "Grapes! Grapes!" they were shouting. All those people sat down and ate the grapes, and then went to the hillside and picked more. "Now we are indeed in Wineland," they said. "It is as wonderful as Leif's stories. Surely we must stay here for a long time." The very next day they went into the woods and began to cut out lumber. The huts that they built were little things. They had no windows, and in the doorways the men hung their cloaks instead of doors. "We can be out in the air so much in this warm country," said Gudrid, "that we do not need fine houses." The huts were scattered all about, some on the side of the lake, some at the shore of the harbor, some on the hillside. Gudrid had said, "I want to live by the lake, where I can look into the green woods and hear sweet bird noises." So Thorfinn built his hut there. As they sat about the campfire one night, Bjarni said, "It is strange that so good a land should be empty. I suppose that these are the first houses that were ever built in Wineland. It is wonderful to think that we are alone here in this great land." All that winter no snow fell. The cattle pastured on the grass. "To think of the cold, frozen winters in Greenland," Gudrid said. "Oh, this is the sun's own land." In the beginning of that winter, a little son was born to Gudrid and Thorfinn. "A health to the first Winelander," the men shouted, and drank down their wine, for they had made some from Wineland grapes. "Will he be the father of a great country, as Ingolf was?" Bjarni mused. Gudrid looked at her baby and smiled. "You will be as sunny as this good land, I hope," she said. They named him Snorri. He grew fast and soon crept along the yellow sand and toddled among the grapevines and climbed into the boats and learned to talk. The men called him the Wineland King. "I never knew a baby before," one of the men said. "No," said another. "Swords are jealous, but when they are in their scabbards we can do other things, even play with babies." "I wonder whether I have forgotten how to swing my sword in this quiet land," another man said. One spring morning when the men got up and went out from their huts to the fires to cook, they saw a great many canoes in the harbor. Men were in them, paddling toward shore. "What is this?" cried the Norsemen to one another. "Where did they come from? Are they foes? Who ever saw such boats before? The men's faces are brown." "Let every man have his sword ready," cried Thorfinn, "but do not draw until I command. Let us go to meet them." So they went and stood on the shore. Soon the men from the canoes landed and stood looking at the Norsemen. The strangers' skin was brown, their faces were broad, their hair was black, their bodies were short, they wore leather clothes. One man among them seemed to be chief. He spread out his open hands to the Norsemen. "He is showing us that he has no weapons," Bjarni said. "He comes in peace." Then Thorfinn showed his empty hands and asked, "What do you want?" The stranger said something, but the Norsemen could not understand. It was some new language. Then the chief pointed to one of the huts and walked toward it. He and his men walked all around it and felt of the timber and went into it and looked at all the things there, spades and cloaks and drinking horns. As they looked, they talked together. They went to all the other huts and looked at everything there. One of them found a red cloak. He spread it out and showed it to the others. They all stood about it and looked at it and felt of it and talked fast. "They seem to like my cloak," Bjarni said. One of the strangers went down to their canoes and soon came back with an armload of furs, fox skins, otter skins, beaver skins. The chief took some and held them out to Thorfinn and hugged the cloak to him. "He wants to trade," Thorfinn said. "Will you do it, Bjarni?" "Yes," Bjarni answered and took the furs. "If they want red stuff, I have a whole roll of red cloth that I will trade," one of the other men said. He went and got it. When the strangers saw it, they quickly held out more furs and seemed eager to trade. So Thorfinn cut the cloth into pieces and sold every scrap. When the strangers got it, they tied it about their heads and seemed much pleased. While this trading was going on and everybody was good-natured, a bull of Thorfinn's ran out of the woods bellowing and came towards the crowd. When the strangers heard it and saw it, they threw down whatever was in their hands and ran to their canoes and paddled off as fast as they could. The Norsemen laughed. "We have lost our customers," Bjarni said. "Did they never see a bull before?" laughed one of the men. Now after 3 weeks, the Norsemen saw canoes in the bay again. This time it was black with them. There were so many. The people in them were all making a horrible shout. "It is a war cry," Thorfinn said, and he raised a red shield. "They are surely 20 to our 1, but we must fight. Stand in close line and give them a taste of your swords." Even as he spoke, a great shower of stones fell upon them. Some of the Norsemen were hit on the head and knocked down. Bjarni got a broken arm. Still the storm came fast. The strangers had landed and were running toward the Norsemen. They threw their stones with slingshots, and they yelled all the time. "Oh, this is no kind of fighting for brave men," Thorfinn cried angrily. The Norsemen's swords swung fast, and many of the strangers died under them. But still others came on, throwing stones and swinging stone axes. The horrible yelling and the strange things that the savages did frightened the Norsemen. "These are not men," someone cried. Then those Norsemen, who had never been afraid of anything, turned and ran. But when they came to the top of a rough hill, Thorfinn cried, "What are we doing? Shall we die here in this empty land with no one to bury us? We are leaving our women." Then one of the women ran out of the hut where they were hiding. "Give me a sword," she cried. "I can drive them back. Are Norsemen not better than these savages?" Then those warriors stopped, ashamed, and stood up before the wild men, and fought so fiercely that the strangers turned and fled down to their canoes and paddled away. "Oh, I am glad they are gone," Thorfinn said. "It was an ugly fight." "Thor would not have loved that battle," one said. "It was no battle," another replied. "It was like fighting against an army of poisonous flies." The Norsemen were all worn and bleeding and sore. They went to their huts and dressed their wounds, and the women helped them. At supper that night they talked about the fight for a long time. "I will not stay here," Gudrid said. "Perhaps these wild men have gone away to get more people and will come back and kill us. Oh, they are ugly. Perhaps brown faces are looking at us now from behind the trees in the woods back there," said Bjarni. It was the wish of all to go home, so after a few days they sailed back to Greenland with good weather all the way. The people at Eric's house were very glad to see them. "We were afraid you had died," they said. "And I thought once that we should never leave Wineland alive," Thorfinn answered. Then they told all the story. "I wonder why I had no such bad luck," Leif said. "But you have a better shipload than I got." He was looking at the bundles of fur and the kegs of wine. "Yes," said Thorfinn, "we have come back richer than when we left, but I will never go again for all the skins in the woods." The next summer, Thorfinn took Gudrid and Snorri and all his people and sailed back to Iceland, his home. There he lived until he died. People looked at him in wonder. "That is the man who went to Wineland and fought with wild men," they said. "Snorri is his son. He is the first and last Winelander, for no one will ever go there again. It will be an empty and forgotten land." And so it was for a long time. Some wise men wrote down the story of those voyages and of that land, and people read the tale and liked it, but no one remembered where the place was. It all seemed like a fairy tale. Long afterwards, however, men began to read those stories with wide-open eyes and to wonder. They guessed and talked together and studied this and that land and read the story over and over. At last they have learned that Wineland was in America, on the eastern shore of the United States, and they have called Snorri the first American, and have put up statues of Leif Erikson, the first comer to America. End of chapter 15. End of part 2, West Overseas.
Chapter 16 of Viking Tales. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Chapter 16. Descriptive Notes. House. In a rich Norseman's home were many buildings. The finest and largest was the great feast hall. Next were the bower, where the women worked, and the guest room where the visitors slept. Beside these were storehouses, stables, workshops, and a kitchen, a sleeping house for thralls. All these buildings were made of heavy, hewn logs, covered with tar to fill the cracks and to keep the wood from rotting. The ends of the logs, the doorposts, the peaks of gables were carved into shapes of men and animals and were painted with bright colors. These gay buildings were close together, often set around four sides of a square yard. That yard was a busy and pleasant place, with men and women running across from one bright building to another. Sometimes a high fence with one gate went around all this, and only the tall carved peaks of roofs shone from the outside. Names. An old Norse story says, most men had two names in one, and thought it likeliest to lead to long life and good luck to have double names. To be called after a god was very lucky. Here are some of the double names with their meanings. Thorstein means Thor's stone. Thorkel means Thor's fire. Thorbjorn means Thor's bear. Gudbrand means Gunnar's sword. Gunnar was one of the Valkyrias. Gunnbjorn means Gunnar's bear. Gudrid means Gunnar's rider. Gudrad means Gunnar Landclear. Most of the land in old Norway was covered with forests. When a man got new land, he had to clear off the trees. In those olden days, a man did not have a surname that belonged to everyone in his family. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 men with the same name in a neighborhood. That caused trouble. People thought of 2 ways of making it easy to tell which man was being spoken of. Each was given a nickname. Suppose the name of each was Hockey. One would be called Hockey the Black because he had black hair. The other would be called Hockey the Ship-chested because his chest was broad and strong. These nicknames were often given only for the fun of it. Most men had them. Eric the Red, Leif the Lucky, Harold Hairfair, Rolf Go-Afoot. The other way of knowing one Heike from the other was to tell his father's name. One was Heike, Eric's son. The other was Heike, Halfdan's son. If you speak these names quickly, they sound like Heike Eriksson and Heike Halfdanson. After a while, they were written like that, and men handed them on to their sons and daughters. Some names that we have nowadays have come down to us just in that way. Swanson, Anderson, Peterson, Jansen. There was another reason for these last names. A man was proud to have people know who his father was. Drinking horns. The Norsemen had few cups or goblets. They used instead of horns of cattle, polished and trimmed with gold or silver or bronze. They were often very beautiful, and a man was almost as proud of his drinking horn as his sword. Tables. Before a meal, thralls brought trestles to the feast hall and set them before the benches. Then they laid long boards across from trestle to trestle. These narrow tables stretched all the way along both sides of the hall. People sat at the outside edge only, so the thralls served from the middle of the room. They put baskets of bread and wooden platters of meat upon these bare boards. At the end of the meal they carried the tables out and all, and the drinking horns went round in a clean room. Beds. Around the sides of the feast hall were shut beds. They were like big boxes with doors opening into the hall. On the floor of this box was straw with blankets thrown over it. The people got in these beds and closed the doors, and so shut themselves in. Olaf's men could have set heavy things against these doors or to put props against them. Then the people could not have got out, for on the other side of the bed was the thick outside wall of the feast wall, and there were no windows in it. Feast hall. The feast hall was long and narrow, with the door at each end. Down the middle of the room were flat stones and the dirt floor. Here the fires burned. In the roof above these fires were holes for the smoke to go out, but some of it blew about the hall, and the halls and rafters were stained with it. But it was a pleasant wood smoke, and the Norsemen did not dislike it. There were no large windows in the feast hall, or in other Norse buildings. High up under the eaves, or in the roof itself, were narrow slits that were called wind's eyes. There were no glass in them, for the Norsemen did not know how to make it, but there were instead covers made of thin oiled skin. These were put into the wind's eyes in stormy weather. There were covers, too, for the smoke holes, the only light that came through these narrow holes. So on dark days the people needed the fires much for light as for warmth. Foster father. A Norse father sent his children away from home to grow up. They went when they were 3 or 4 years old and stayed until they were grown. The father thought, they will be better, so if they stayed home, their mother would spoil them with much petting. Foster brothers. When 2 men loved each other very much and said, let us become foster brothers. Then they went and cut 3 long pieces of turf and put a spear into the ground that held up the strips of turf like an arch. Runes were cut into the handle of the spear, telling the duties of the foster brothers. The 2 men walked under this arch, and each made a little cut in his palm. They knelt with clasped hands so that the blood of the 2 flowed together, and they said, now we are of one blood. Then each made his vow. I will fight for my foster brother whenever he shall need me. If he is killed before I am, I will punish the man who did it. Whatever things I own are as much my foster brother's as mine. I will love this man until I die. I call Odin and Thor and all the gods to hear my vow. May they hate me if I break it. Ran. Ran was the wife of Aegir, who was the god of the sea. They lived in a cave at the bottom of the ocean. Ran had a great net, and she caught in it all men who were shipwrecked and took them to her cave. She also caught all the gold and rich treasures that went down in the ships. So her cave was filled with shining things. Valkyries. These were the maidens of Odin. They waited on the table in Valhalla, but whenever a battle was being fought, they rode through the air on their horses and watched to see what warriors were brave enough to go to Valhalla. Sometimes during a fight, a man would think that he saw the Valkyries. Then he was glad, for he knew he would go to Valhalla. An old Norse story says this about Valkyries. With lightning around them, with bloody shirts of mail, and with shining spears, they ride through the air and the ocean. When their horses shake their manes, dew falls on the deep valleys and hail on the high forests. Odin's ravens. Odin had a great throne in his palace in Asgard. When he sat in it, he could look all over the world, but it was so far to see that he could not tell all the things that were happening. So he had 2 ravens help him. An old Norse story tells this about him. Two ravens sit on Odin's shoulders and whisper into his ears all that they have heard and seen. He sees them out at dawn of day to see over the whole world. They return at evening near mealtime. This is why Odin knows so many things. Reykjavik means smoky sea. Ingolf called it that because of the steaming hot springs by the sea. The place is still called Reykjavik. A little city has grown up there, the only city in Iceland. It is the capital of the country. Peace bands. A Norseman always carried his sword, even at a feast, for he did not know when he might need it. But when he went somewhere on an errand of peace and had no quarrel, he tied his sword into his scabbard, and with white bands that he called peace bands. If all at once something happened to make him need his sword, he broke the peace bands and drew it out. Eskimos. Now the Eskimos live in Greenland and Alaska and on the very northern shores of Canada. But once they lived farther south in pleasanter lands. After a while, other Indian tribes began to grow strong. Then they wanted the pleasant land of the Eskimos and the seashore that the Eskimos had. So they fought again and again with those people and won and drove them farther north and farther north. At least the Eskimos were on the very shores of the cold sea, with the Indians still pushing them on. So some of them got into their boats and rowed across the narrow water and came to Greenland and lived there. Some people think that these things happened before Eric found Greenland. In that case, he found Eskimos there, and Thorfinn saw red Indians in Wineland. The other people think that this happened after Eric went to Greenland. If this is true, he found an empty land, and it was Eskimos that Thorfinn saw in Wineland. End of chapter 16. Descriptive notes. Chapter 17. Suggestions to teachers of Viking Tales. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Chapter 17. Suggestions to teachers. Possibly this book seems made up of 4 or 5 disconnected stories. They are, however, strung upon one thread: the westward emigration from Norway. The story of Harold is intended to serve in 2 ways toward the working out of the plot. It gives the general setting that continues throughout the book in costume, houses, ideals, habits. It explains the cause of emigration from the mother country. It is really an introductory chapter. As for the other stories, they are distinctly steps in the process of the plot. A chain of islands loosely connects Norway with America. Orkneys and Shetlands, Faroes, Iceland, Greenland. It was from the link to link of this chain that Norsemen sailed in search of home and adventure. Discoveries were made by accident. Ships were driven by wind from known island to unknown. These 2 points, the island connection that made possible the long voyage from Norway to America, and the contribution of storm to discovery, I've stated in the book only dramatically. I emphasize them here, hoping that the teacher will make sure that the children see them and possibly that they state them abstractly. Let me speak as to the proper imaging of the stories. I have not often interrupted incident with special description, not because I do not consider the getting of vivid and detailed images most necessary to full enjoyment and proper intellectual habits, but because I trusted to the pictures of this book and to the teacher to do what seemed to me inartistic to do in the story. Some of these descriptions and explanations I've introduced into the book in the form of notes, hoping that the children, in turning them, might form a habit of insisting upon full understanding of a point, and might possibly, with the teacher's encouragement, begin the habit of reference reading. The landscape of Norway, Iceland, Greenland is beautiful, and will greatly assist in giving reality and definiteness to the stories. Materials for this study are not difficult of access. Foreign-colored photographs of Norwegian landscape are becoming common in our art stores. There are good illustrations in the geographical works referred to in the book list. These would be copied upon the blackboard. There are 3 books beautifully illustrated in color that would be possible to find only in large libraries. Coast of Norway by Walton, Travels in the Island of Iceland by Mackenzie, Voyage en Islande to Groenland by J.P. Geimard. If the landscape is studied from the point of view of formation, the images will be more accurate and more easily gained, and the study will have general value that will continue past the reading of these stories into all work of geography. Trustworthy pictures of Norse houses and costumes are difficult to obtain. In Viking Age and Story of Norway by Boyesen, G.P. Putnam's Sons, New York, are many copies of Norse antiquities in the fashion of weapons, shield bosses, coins, jewelry, wood carving. These are, of course, accurate, but of little interest to children. Their chief value lies in helping the teacher piece together a picture that she can finally give to her pupils. Metalworking and wood carving were the most important arts of the Norse. If children study products of these arts and actually do some of the work, they will gain a quickened sympathy with the people and an appreciation of their power. They may perhaps make something to merely illustrate Norse work, for instance, a carved ship's head, or a copper shield, or a wrought doornail. But better, they may apply Norse ideas of form and decoration, and Norse processes in making some modern thing that they can actually use. For instance, a carved wood pin tray or copper match holder. This work should bleed out into a study of these same industries among ourselves with visits to woodworking shops and metal foundries. Frequent drawn or painted illustration by the children of costumes, landscapes, houses, feast halls, and ships will help to make these images clear, but dramatization will do more than anything else for the interpreting of the stories and characters. It'd be an excellent thing if at last, through the dramatization of the handwork, the children should come into sufficient understanding and enthusiasm to turn skalds and compose songs in the Norse manner. This requires only a small vocabulary and a rough feeling for simple rhythm, but an intensity of emotion and a great vividness of image. These Norse stories have, to my thinking, 3 values. The men, with the crude courage and strange adventures that make a man interesting to children, have at the same time love of truth and hearty endurance, the faithfulness to plighted word that make a child's good companions. Again, in form and in matter, Old Norse literature is well worth our reading. I should deem it a great thing accomplished if the children who read these stories should be tempted after a while to read those fine old books, to enjoy the tales, to appreciate straightforwardness and simplicity of style. The historical value of story of Leif Erikson and the others seems to me to be not to learn. The fact that Norsemen discovered America before Columbus did, but to gain a conception of the conditions of early navigation, of the length of voyage, of the dangers of the sea, and a consequent realization of the reason for the fact that America was unknown to medieval Europe, of why Norsemen did not travel, was necessary to be done before men could strike out across the ocean. Norse story is only one chapter in the tale of American discovery. I give below an outline of a year's work on the subject that was once followed by the 4th grade of Chicago Normal School. The idea in it is to give importance, sequence, reasonableness, broad connections to the discovery of America. The head of the history department who planned this course says it is, in a sense, a dramatization of the development of geographical knowledge. Following is a bare topical outline of the work: evolution of the forms of boats, Viking tales, a crusade as a tale of travel and discovery, monasteries as centers of work, printing, story of Marco Polo, Columbus's discovery, story of Vasco da Gama, story of Magellan. End of chapter 17. Suggestions to teachers.
Section 18 of Viking Tales. A reading list. Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Section 18. Geography. Norway. The Earth and its Inhabitants. Recluse. D. Appleton and Company, New York. Iceland. The Earth and its Inhabitants. Iceland. Baring Goldsmith, Elder and Company, London, 1863. Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes, Harper Brothers, New York. An American in Iceland, Neeland. Lockwood, Brooke and Company, Boston, 1876. Greenland, the Earth and its Inhabitants, Recluse, D. Appleton and Company, New York. Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes, Harper Brothers, New York. Customs. Viking Age, Du Chaillu, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1889. Private Life of the Old Northmen, Kaiser, translated by Barnard. Chapman and Hall, London, 1868. Saga Time, Vicary. Keegan, Paul, Trench, Tribner and Company, London. Story of Burnt Njal, Introduction, Dasent, Edmonston and Douglas, Edinburgh, 1861. Vikings of the Baltic, a Romance, Dasent, Edmonston and Douglas, Edinburgh. Ivar the Viking, a Romance, Du Chaillu, Charles Scribner's Sons, New York. Viking Path, a Romance, Haldane Burgess, V. M. Blackwood and Sons, Edinburgh, 1894. Northern Antiquities, Percy, edited by Blackwell, Bourne, London, 1859. Mythology. The Prose Edda, Northern Antiquities, Percy, edited by Blackwell, Bourne, London, 1859. Norse Mythology, Anderson, Scott, Forsman and Company, Chicago, 1876. Norse Stories, Mabi, Rand McNally and Company, Chicago, 1902. Northern Mythology, Thorpe, Lumley, London, 1851. Classic Myths, Judd, Rand McNally and Company, Chicago, 1902. Incidents: Harold, Saga of Harold Hairfair in Saga Library, Magnusson and Morris, Volume 1, Bernard Quaritch, London, Charles Scribner's Sons, New York, 1892. Ingolf, Norsemen in Iceland, Dasent in Oxford Essays, Volume 4, Parker and Son, London, 1858. Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, Harper Brothers, New York. A Winter in Iceland and Lapland, Dillon, Henry Colburn, London, 1840. Eric, Leif and Thorfinn, The Finding of Wineland the Good, Reeves, Henry Froude, 1890. America Not Discovered by Columbus, Anderson, Scott, Forsman and Company, Chicago, 1891. Credibility of Story, Windsor's Narrative and Critical History of America, Volume 1, C. A. Nichols and Company, Springfield, Massachusetts, 1895. Discovery of America, Fiske, Volume 1, Houghton, Mifflin and Company, Boston, 1892. Other sagas easily accessible. Saga Library, 5 volumes, Morris and Magnusson, Bernard Quaritch, London, Charles Scribner's Sons, New York, 1892, as follows. The Story of Howard the Halt, The Story of the Banded Men, The Story of Hen Thorir, done into English out of Icelandic by William Morris and Eirikur Magnusson. The Story of the Ere-dwellers with the Story of the Heath Slayings as appendix, done into English out of the Icelandic by William Morris and Eirikur Magnusson. The Stories of the Kings of Norway, called The Round World, Heimskringla, by Snorri Sturluson, done into English by William Morris and Eirikur Magnusson, with a large map of Norway in 3 volumes. Gisli the Outlaw, Dasent, Edmonston and Douglas, Edinburgh. Orkneyinga Saga, Anderson, Edmonston and Douglas, Edinburgh. Volsunga Saga, Morris and Magnusson, Walter Scott, London. The Younger Edda, Anderson, Scott, Forsman and Company, Chicago, 1880. A full bibliography of the sagas may be found in Volsunga Saga. End of section 18 and end of the book Viking Tales by Jenny Hall. Read by Lars Rolander.